The Israeli military has assassinated Ibrahim Al-Nabulsi in Nablus. He was the commander of the al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. Just days ago, Israel assassinated 2 leaders of the Islamic Jihad Movement and bombed the Gaza Strip in what was described as a preemptive operation. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at why there has been such Israeli assassinations of Palestinian leaders and fighters in a short spate of time, while Israel continues committing raids, which has led to numerous injuries and arrests.
Israeli forces have assassinated Ibrahim Al-Nabulsi, a resistance fighter and commander of the al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades in the occupied West Bank city of Nablus. Israeli troops raided Nablus early Tuesday and surrounded a building in the old city where Al-Nabulsi had barricaded himself in. A gunfight lasted for several hours with Israeli forces even firing anti-tank missiles at the building. 32-year-old Islam Sabbouh and 16-year-old teen Hussein Jamal Taha were also killed in the raid. At least 60 Palestinians were wounded, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry.
We have not witnessed such an aggressive raid to Nablus in years. The aim was to assassinate al-Nabulsi and any other Palestinian who was assisting him. He refused to surrender and clashed with the soldiers for hours and was finally martyred.
As the raid started, we rushed to the old town, but the soldiers had blocked the neighborhood. They opened fire at us. We tried to evacuate the wounded, including a woman, but they continued shooting at us. Dozens were wounded as a result.
Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid has reacted to Nablus operation, saying that the killing of whom he described as terrorist Ibrahim Nabulsi was another step in Israel's uncompromising fight against terrorism.
This cell has been warring Israeli military. They carried out a number of shootings against Israeli soldiers and settlers. That is why the Israeli military wanted to strike them and kill one of its leaders.
A number of West Bank cities, including Ramallah and Al-Khalil, observed commercial strikes as part of a period of mourning and in protest at the killings in Nablus. The regime forces clashed with the protesters in Al-Khalil and shot dead at least 1 Palestinian. It has become clear that Israel is targeting any Palestinian who is honored as a real fighter. The regime might succeed in assassinating those fighters like Ibrahim Al-Nabulsi, but they would even be remembered as heroes and icons who devoted their lives to fighting Israeli soldiers. Mona Qandil for Press TV, occupied Ramallah.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Hafsa Kara Mustafa joins us. She is a journalist and Middle East expert who joins us from London. Also joining us is Yusuf Al-Halou, political analyst who joins us from London. Welcome to you both. Yusuf Al-Halou, I'm going to start with you and get a reaction from you in what has occurred, where you have the assassination in Nablus of Al-Nabulsi, commander of the al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and also Hussein Jamal Taha, both senior members of resistance groups. It was somewhat of a major operation in the way that they took both of them out. What is your impression of what Israel has done there in Nablus?
Well, I think this is a continuation of Israel's systematic policy of provoking Palestinian resistance groups, whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank. I think this is a clear message to all Palestinian resistance factions, not only Islamic Jihad, but also Fatah movement, the secular party that has been ruling the West Bank for the past 25, 30 years. I think Israel at will, it can invade, it can storm the houses of Palestinians day or night, it can kill, arrest, injure, maim, and this is clearly because Israel enjoys a culture of impunity, and the stance, obviously, of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is somehow weak when it comes to condemning Israeli attacks or to put an end. Obviously, the Palestinians, they don't accept this kind of occupation to go on. The resistance hands in the West Bank are tied. The support for the resistance is high among the Palestinian population. But when it comes to the official protection, it's absence. So that's why Israel can invade, can create excuses to say that it wants to arrest or kill this wanted person. If we look at what happened in Gaza, obviously it was unprovoked attack to assassinate members of Islamic Jihad movement, and this applies to other resistance activities across the occupied Palestinian territories. So Israel does not need a justification or an excuse to attack or kill. Israel enjoys this.
Well, that is the thrust of my next question, Hafsa Kara Mustafa. The official statement, as it was tweeted by the Israeli forces, said Palestinian terrorist Ibrahim Al-Nabulsi was suspected, underline that word, suspected of carrying out shooting attacks on civilians and Israeli soldiers in the Nablus area. Prior to that, when you had the Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, which lasted for 3 days, Israel said that they carried out a preemptive operation, which ended up in the death of these two Islamic Jihad fighters, along with obviously the rest of the civilian population that got killed, up to, I'm not too sure, it was over 40 or 50 at this point. An operation they carried out where they suspected the leaders perhaps to carry out what they thought was an operation. So just based on something that hasn't happened, Israel goes out and assassinates, in this case in point, senior leaders of these resistance groups. That's the focus of my question to you as to why that is acceptable to them.
Well, it is acceptable to them only because they can get away with it. Essentially, it is always down to Israel's impunity. I mean, this is the definition of behaving outside the rule of law. In illegality, you do not execute anybody because you merely suspect them. Under any form of regime, there is some form of court of law, some sort of process to determine whether somebody is guilty of any crime or not. And this is coming from the country that the West is trying to sell to its public opinion as the only democracy in the Middle East. Of course, it's not. We know it's not. It's a terrorist entity that actually relies on murder and massacres and mass slaughter to continue. And it does that routinely, to show the Palestinians that it can, that it needs to keep them under their authority. And then, of course, it's a reminder to neighboring countries as well that it can get away with it because, of course, there's going to be no condemnation whatsoever from Western nations which support Israel regardless. So not only does Israel enjoy impunity, but it knows there's going to be no consequences. And again, of course, it has, with the recent the warming of relationship with some Arab states, this has even emboldened them again because there has been no consequence to their criminal action over and over again. If anything, now, more recently, they're even rewarded for their criminality. So why stop there, essentially?
The Israeli Prime Minister, Yusuf al-Hulu, did you want to say something?
No, I was shaking my head. I agree with the guest. Obviously, Palestinians are squeezed into the corner. They are being crushed by Israel's military power. Israel uses the Palestinians are testing the ground, whether it's the West Bank or Gaza, to train its soldiers. It thinks that Palestinian blood is cheap because obviously we haven't seen any of Israeli officials was ever held accountable to this. That's why it's got the green light from the Biden administration. The international community does nothing to stop this situation. And obviously, Palestinians have to accept it. This is what Israel thinks.
Well, we've talked about this green light and the fact that you don't have condemnation coming. And Hafsa Kara Mustafa, one of the things that's really amazing about the way that this works out, this green light approach, is the way that the U.S. and EU actually did that when it came to the assault by Israel on the Gaza Strip. And this is their common rhetoric that they relay, urging all sides to avoid further escalation, but then they say they absolutely fully support Israel's right to defend itself. So isn't that the green light, which in turn means a code, go ahead, keep bombing Gaza?
It's a bit like if you're seeing two people fighting in the street and then you tell them, please stop, but then you hand over somebody an arm and say, listen, please stop, but then you're still handing them a weapon. So this is essentially what they're doing. And obviously the two sides are in no way equal because on the one hand, you have one that has a very sophisticated and well-funded army and the other side doesn't. It merely has some form of weaponry that it manages to smuggle in very difficultly in order to carry out some form of guerrilla warfare which again is in its right and entrenched in international law in order to resist occupation. So I think the absolute chutzpah that we're seeing coming from Western powers is repulsive, but not surprising, because it's precisely this attitude that allows Israel to get away with it. And we've seen over and over again, and I think the context, the international context, is always important, because whenever there is news that actually take over public opinion, such as the war in Ukraine, such as the collapse of cost of living in many Western countries, you will see that the Israelis use that because opinion is distracted elsewhere, and they make a point of actually carrying out these massacres and these raids and these operations, punitive operations, to punish the Palestinians and remind them essentially that they're completely isolated, that they have no recourse, no option other than to just support and bear what the Israelis are inflicting on them. So yes, it is absolutely repulsive, but it's not surprising. Unfortunately, it's going to also have many consequences on the international stage, because we're now seeing the complete erosion of international law anywhere across the country. And I think overall, over the next few years, we're going to see some form of consequences of this attitude from many countries.
Well, the consequences come in many different shapes and forms. We're looking at a possible intifada were to take place. But Yusuf Al-Halou, please give us an introspective as to what you think has occurred where you have Israel come out in a matter of just a short span of time, within a week, target the Islamic Jihad leaders over in the Gaza Strip, and then you have these leaders over in Nablus. It's a rather short period of time for them to go after these targeted assassinations. What do you make of that?
Yes, well, it's pre-planned. The current ruling party in Israel, led by Yair Lapid, I think he wants to appease the public opinion in Israel and to attract more voters in the upcoming elections. And it has been the norm that Palestinians are the scapegoat. Palestinian blood is the only way for Israeli officials to gain more votes in any elections in Israel's history. It was unprovoked attack by assassinating Taysir Jabari, the commander in Islamic Jihad Movement in Gaza, and then another official, and the rest have been civilians mainly. I think it's to do with gaining a credit to the Israeli officials of the current government, and also to deepen the geographical separation between Gaza and the West Bank, and also to deepen the split between Hamas and Islamic Jihad, because Israel said clearly that they are only attacking Islamic Jihad and they did not attack any Hamas facilities, or they did not attack any Hamas member. So this clearly succeeded in putting this separation between the two large political parties and military groups in Gaza, and also it wants to divide Gaza from the West Bank. It didn't want the West Bankers to revolt or take to the streets. It didn't want the Gazans to react to what's going on in Nablus. And also it's to do with the silence of the international community. We call it the hypocrisy of the international community, the international conspiracy of silence. The world is busy, nations are tackling different things, but we know that the morale and the consciousness of the Arab world, the Islamic world, is very high. But unfortunately, governments are tidying the hands of, obviously they will never agree to open their borders to come and liberate Palestine, because obviously there are agreements, and Israel has been using Gaza to scare other nations, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza. So Gaza has been always the weakest link.
Okay. Well, it's quite ironic what Yair Lapid has said, Hafsakar Mustafa, which was highlighted by Russia. And this is when he was not the PM. And he talked about Ukraine, saying intentionally, I'm quoting him, harming a civilian population is a war crime, and I strongly condemn it. A tweet back from April, of which Russia highlighted, and basically accusing Russia of war crimes, alleged bombing that happened that was that had Russia as being the one that executed it. Obviously, your reaction to that, how he shows disregard and contempt for Palestinian lives with that type of statement.
Absolutely, and I think, I mean, I'm taking back my fellow panelists was saying that Palestinian blood is cheap, and not just Palestinian, essentially. I mean, Muslim blood and Middle Eastern blood in general, we've noticed, whether it's Palestine, of course, or whether it's Afghanistan, phrases like collateral damage and everything have been mentioned so many times by Western leaders, by Western media, and we can see the distinction. As you recall, with Ukraine, they were opposed to the idea that fellow blonde, blue-eyed Westerners could be victims of war, as opposed to the fact that brown people, darker skinned people, were absolutely okay with being bombed to smithereens by either Israeli or American bombs. So this idea that non-Israeli or non-Western blood is acceptable, it can be spilled absolutely with complete disregard, is common and is fiercely entrenched in the minds of many people in Israeli opinion and in Western public opinion as well. And I think this is the major problem, because as long as there is this us and them attitude, the way that they're dehumanizing the population of Palestine or elsewhere, this is the kind of attitude that allows this to happen. And I think that, you know, when they feel the brunt of the wars and the consequences, that's when Westerners start reacting. But actually, as long as they see this happening very far away, and they dehumanize the victims in such a way to the point where they don't even regard them as fellow humans being killed, then these kinds of attitude become completely normalized. And this is the racist attitude that is fundamental basis of the state of Israel.
Indeed. Yusuf, hello. I don't know if you... Go ahead, Yusuf.
Yeah, sorry, can you ask the question? It wasn't me.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yusuf, I don't know if you saw the funeral procession for Nablusi and Nabu. I covered it live, and I saw also images coming through on Twitter afterwards when I was reviewing material for this program. And it was quite big. It was a large procession. And Israeli forces, from what I understand, had actually targeted some of the people there in the procession. Some attributed to the fact that there was gunfire coming from the Palestinians who were mourning into the air. So that alarmed the Israeli forces. But it was kind of reminiscent of the funeral procession for Shireen Abu Akleh. In terms of it wasn't as big, but it was pretty large. My question to you is, do you think, given the fact that you have so many Palestinians that came out, and you have these instances, that in this case in point happening so close to each other, that perhaps Palestinians are reaching that boiling point, reaching the precipice, that they're ready to do something? Because we're seeing so many different instances. Not that it doesn't happen on a daily basis, but so close to each other.
Well, Palestinians are really frustrated under decades of military occupation, roadblocks, checkpoints, drone arrests, campaigns, and so on. They cannot take it anymore. So they stand side by side, shoulder by shoulder, to show solidarity and sympathy with the families of those who lost their sons, beloved ones. And also, you know, at the end of the day, Israel controls what goes in, what gets out of the occupied Palestinian territories. And the numbers that marched today or in the past few days, it shows that Palestinians, they have still got the steadfastness, they still got the spirit to show their objection to the Israeli occupation. I mean, any teenager, Israeli soldier just can open fire and kill and does things without accountability. So the persecution is, I mean, it's unacceptable anymore. Young people cannot take it anymore. Israel thinks by the latest technology, by making life harsh and hard, people will forget about resisting, will forget about their homeland. But this did not happen, and it will not happen. And this is a proof to Israel that whatever it does, Palestinians basically simply will not give up until their lands are liberated.
This resolve is something that needs to, obviously, number one, be applauded. But I'm going to take one of the instances of an online tweet that I need to ask you, Hafsakara Mustafa, and get your reaction to, of which it said, what does a ceasefire mean as long as the occupation of Palestine continues, the siege of Gaza continues, and Israel is allowed to bomb our children to pieces every election season? Your reaction to that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, none of the agreements that Israel has sort of claims to abide by has actually been respected. And I think this is the perverse nature of how they're controlling this narrative. They are not going in for massive long-term operations. These short burst operations are exactly designed to keep the Palestinian people constantly weakened without being able to properly organize. And the thing is, if it was a long-term conflict, then people could actually organize and could be more structured. But what happens is these small bouts mean that the civilian population, every time it stops, it sort of takes a deep breath and thanks God that everything has stopped, that the bombing rates have stopped, and some form of normality returns. And this is how this sort of perverse nature of the operations are carried out, because what the Israelis are doing is they sort of leave the Palestinians a bit of rest, and then they come back every 6 months, every 8 months, every 2 years, just to remind them who is actually in charge. And this is torture, essentially. If you put a prisoner inside a cell and you would give him some regular beatings or regularly deprived him of food or things like that, but then fed him again, he'd be constantly in search of that moment of peace. And this is how the Palestinian people are kept in check. Sadly, this very, very disturbing, very perverse form of occupation is stopping any mass movement from being organized and actually finally tackling the Israelis in a proper way. Of course, it's going to be very difficult, and I think the only option would be some sort of long-term guerrilla warfare. But because of the nature of the conflict, this is why it's not being possible. And this is how the Israelis are controlling the narrative at the moment.
Thank you so much for that. We're unfortunately fresh out of time. Hafsa Mustafa, journalist and Middle East expert, with her contribution from London. Thank you so much. And Yusuf Al-Halou, glad to see you, political analyst from London. Thank you so much. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mikava Takwe and the entire team, it's goodbye until next time.